The island of Saipan was one of the most strategic points in the Pacific, its capture essential for America's push toward Japan. The Japanese had transformed the island into a fortress with miles of jagged cliffs, hidden caves, and bunkers built into the rugged terrain. Every ridge and hill was carefully defended, every beach carefully prepared to slow and punish an invading force. The defenders were well-trained, highly disciplined, and determined to fight to the death, believing that the loss of Saipan would bring the American forces closer to Japan itself. On June 15, 1944, the first waves of American Marines approached the island under the cover of early morning darkness. Landing craft cut through the choppy surf, carrying soldiers toward beaches that had been carefully mapped as kill zones by the Japanese. As the Marines hit the sand, gunfire erupted from hidden positions, machine guns rattling and artillery shells exploding nearby. The air was thick with smoke, sand, and the screams of men, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was drowned out by the roar of battle. Tanks attempted to advance across the beaches, but many became stuck on obstacles deliberately placed to slow their progress, and mines hidden beneath the sand tore through armor with deadly efficiency. Every step forward cost lives, and yet the Marines pressed on, driven by training, determination, and the knowledge that retreat was not an option. The terrain itself became a weapon for the Japanese. Dense jungles and steep ridges concealed sniper nests and ambush points, and soldiers had to move with extreme caution, knowing that any careless step could be fatal. The Japanese defenders used tunnels and hidden pathways to appear and disappear without warning, striking at Marines from unexpected angles. In the chaos, it was not always clear who had the advantage. Both sides were forced to improvise, adapt, and endure unimaginable stress. The Japanese fought with an intensity born from desperation and belief, making every inch of the island a battlefield where courage and fear collided. Amid the fighting, the presence of civilians added another layer of complexity. Families had been caught on the island as the fighting came closer to their homes, and many were forced to hide or flee as the fighting escalated. The Marines sometimes had to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, while under constant fire, adding tension and urgency to every decision. The civilian experience of Saipan's invasion was one of terror, uncertainty, and survival, and their presence shaped the way the battle unfolded on the ground. Commanders on both sides understood that this was not a battle that could be won with brute force alone. The Americans began to recognize the need for cunning, deception, and careful planning. The Japanese, equally, were intent on exploiting every advantage the terrain offered and every psychological weakness in their opponents. The island became a crucible where strategy, endurance, and human resilience were tested to the extreme. Even in the earliest hours of the invasion, it was clear that Saipan would not be taken easily, and that the decisions made by soldiers and commanders in those initial days would have consequences that echoed across the Pacific. Every engagement, every firefight, every carefully calculated movement contributed to a larger story of survival and tactical brilliance. The Marines' struggle to gain ground under relentless fire set the stage for one of the most infamous moments in the Pacific War, the ambush that would become known as the fake retreat. This would be a battle within the battle, a short but devastating engagement where strategy, deception, and the human cost of war intersected in ways that few could have imagined. Saipan was already a blood-soaked island, but the events to come would define the courage, ingenuity, and terror of the Pacific theater in ways that would haunt both soldiers and historians for decades to come. Even in those early hours, the tension on both sides was palpable. American commanders walked the beaches and ridges, noting the hidden positions and planning their next moves, knowing that every decision could mean survival or death for hundreds of men. Japanese officers encouraged their soldiers to hold the line, reinforcing the belief that each stand, each bullet, and each sacrifice was part of a larger defense that could repel the invaders. The stage was set, the forces were in place, and the island itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the bloodiest hours of the battle to unfold. In the midst of the chaos, no one could foresee the 18-minute trap that would soon change the course of the Saipan campaign and leave a mark in history that would never be forgotten. After days of brutal fighting on Saipan, American commanders realized that traditional assaults were exacting a devastating cost. Japanese defenses were dug in deep, their positions nearly impossible to dislodge with frontal attacks alone. The Marines had learned quickly that courage and determination, while essential, could not overcome the combination of terrain, fortified positions, and fanatical defenders. To gain the upper hand, the Americans needed a plan that went beyond firepower, something unexpected, something that could exploit the enemy's confidence and lure them into a trap. The idea of a fake retreat began to take shape in the minds of senior commanders. It was a gamble, one that required meticulous planning, precise timing, and absolute discipline from every soldier involved. Any misstep could lead to disaster. The plan was simple in concept, but devilishly complex in execution. The Marines would feign a withdrawal, leaving behind visible signs of chaos, abandoned equipment, and even wounded men. The goal was to convince the Japanese that the Americans were fleeing in disarray, an opportunity too tempting to resist. Reconnaissance teams were deployed to identify key locations for hidden artillery, machine gun nests, and tank positions. Every hill, ridge, and narrow pass was analyzed for the maximum killing potential. Engineers reinforced positions that could conceal heavy weapons, while radio operators coordinated signals to ensure that the moment the trap was sprung, firepower would strike simultaneously across multiple points. Soldiers rehearsed movements over and over, learning how to retreat in a way that looked convincing but kept them ready to turn and fight at a moment's notice. The psychological element was just as critical as the physical. The Americans had to anticipate the Japanese response, understanding their eagerness for victory and their willingness to pursue relentlessly. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders were convinced that the Americans were growing weaker. They observed the Marines falling back under pressure, noting the discarded weapons and vehicles. From their perspective, the enemy seemed battered, demoralized, and on the verge of collapse. This perception was exactly what the American planners wanted. By feeding into the Japanese expectations, the Marines set the stage for a moment that would be remembered as one of the most devastating ambushes in Pacific War history. Training for the fake retreat was intense. Units practiced timing and coordination so that every soldier knew when to fall back and when to turn and fire. Artillery crews calculated trajectories down to the last inch, ensuring that shells would land exactly where advancing Japanese forces would be most concentrated. Tank commanders memorized the terrain to drive into ambush positions with precision. Communication lines were established to synchronize the attack, and contingency plans were prepared in case the Japanese reacted unpredictably. Every detail mattered, because in the chaos of battle, small mistakes could mean the difference between victory and slaughter. The Marines were acutely aware of the stakes. Those chosen to lead the feigned retreat had to move convincingly, showing panic without actually losing control. They had to appear vulnerable, to tempt the enemy into overconfidence, while remaining poised to execute the ambush with deadly efficiency. Soldiers carried the weight of the plan, understanding that their performance could end the lives of hundreds of Japanese troops in minutes, and that hesitation or error could cost their own lives. The tension was relentless, but discipline and training prevailed. As the hours before the trap ticked by, the Marines moved into position, concealing artillery and tanks in locations invisible to the Japanese. Every vantage point was covered, every exit blocked, and every unit aware of its role. From hidden caves to camouflaged ridges, the Americans waited, biding their time. On the other side, Japanese forces, unaware of the deception, prepared to advance, believing they had the advantage and sensing a victory within reach. The stage was set for an encounter where psychology and strategy would intersect with lethal precision.
The planning of the fake retreat on Saipan was not merely a tactical maneuver, it was a study in human behavior, anticipation, and control under extreme stress. It relied on understanding the enemy, manipulating expectations, and executing a plan with flawless timing. It was a testament to the ingenuity and audacity of the Marines, who risked everything for a decisive blow. What was about to unfold would not only change the course of the Saipan campaign, but also leave an indelible mark on military history, proving that sometimes the mind, as much as the weapon, can turn the tide of battle.
The moment the fake retreat began, the Japanese forces fell right into the trap. For days they had observed the Marines slowly advancing under fire, and now, seeing them seemingly withdraw in disarray, they believed the tide had turned in their favor. Confidence surged through the Japanese ranks. Officers shouted orders for pursuit, eager to capitalize on what appeared to be a faltering enemy. They advanced across the open terrain, moving toward the abandoned equipment and what they assumed were vulnerable Marines, unaware that every step drew them deeper into a carefully constructed kill zone. As the Japanese approached the designated points, hidden artillery opened fire with precision. Shells screamed through the air, exploding among advancing formations, tearing through men, horses, and vehicles alike. The attack was sudden and absolute. There was no time to react, no cover to escape to. Machine guns erupted from concealed positions, cutting down entire units within seconds. Tanks, previously unseen, rolled into strategic locations, firing along the lines where the Japanese had funneled themselves. The coordinated firepower created a lethal funnel, an execution of strategy and preparation that had been planned down to the last moment. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers on the Japanese side described it later as hell on earth, a scene where the ground itself seemed to erupt in fire. Some tried to seek shelter in the jungle, but the dense vegetation provided little cover from the deadly barrage. Others attempted to retreat, only to stumble into overlapping fields of fire, where every movement was tracked and punished. The combination of artillery, machine guns, and tanks struck with a precision that made the ambush almost surgical. Yet the human cost was staggering. Amid the carnage, the psychological impact on the Japanese soldiers was profound. Many had believed they were seizing an easy victory, only to find themselves surrounded, trapped, and annihilated. The sudden shift from perceived advantage to deadly defeat caused panic and confusion, further increasing casualties. Units that might have resisted in organized fashion were broken apart by fear, their cohesion destroyed almost instantly. For the Americans, watching the plan unfold as intended brought a grim satisfaction, tempered by the stark awareness of how lethal war could be, even when controlled by careful strategy. Eyewitness accounts from both sides provide vivid detail of the ambush. Japanese soldiers recalled the moment the Americans turned and opened fire as a sudden, blinding shock, a torrent of bullets and shells that left no room for thought. Marines described the tension leading up to the attack, the precise timing required, and the moment when all years of training and coordination were put to the ultimate test. Every soldier knew that failure meant death, not just their own, but potentially the collapse of the entire ambush. The 18 minutes became a concentrated display of tactical mastery, human endurance, and the terrifying efficiency of modern warfare. The terrain played an equally crucial role in amplifying the ambush's effect. The Americans had anticipated the Japanese movements, channeling them along paths that seemed safe but led directly into lines of fire. Caves and ridges concealed machine guns, artillery, and infantry, while tanks waited in positions where they could fire along entire approaches. The Japanese soldiers had no idea how thoroughly their path had been mapped and how closely their every step had been accounted for. In that brief span, the island itself became an extension of the trap, amplifying the lethality of every shot and every shell. By the time the ambush ended,
Over 2,800 Japanese soldiers were killed or incapacitated in just 18 minutes. Entire formations were wiped out, leaving behind broken equipment, the wounded, and a battlefield scarred with fire and blood. The fake retreat had shattered the Japanese defensive lines on Saipan, turning what seemed like a fleeting opportunity into one of the most devastating ambushes in the Pacific theater. For the Americans, it was a decisive tactical victory, a demonstration of discipline, planning, and understanding of both terrain and enemy psychology. Yet it was also a haunting reminder of the human cost of war, the scale of destruction, and the thin line between strategy and slaughter. This brief, brutal engagement would not be forgotten. The 18-minute ambush became a case study in military history, a stark example of how deception, preparation, and timing could yield extraordinary results on the battlefield. It was a moment where strategy and human resilience collided, where the planner's foresight met the chaos of combat, and where the consequences of every action were immediate and absolute. On Saipan, in those 18 minutes, history was written in blood, and the island would never be the same again.
The aftermath of the 18-minute ambush on Saipan was both immediate and staggering. The battlefield was strewn with the remnants of what had once been disciplined formations. Japanese soldiers lay fallen in lines and clusters, their weapons scattered across the sand and jungle. Smoke still hung over the terrain, mingling with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning vehicles. Survivors crawled through the wreckage, dazed and desperate, searching for comrades, seeking cover, or simply trying to escape the carnage. The scope of the destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire units had been wiped out in minutes, and the pace at which the ambush had unfolded left few alive to bear witness. For the American Marines, the scene was a stark reminder of the power of strategy, but also of the human toll exacted by war. Every maneuver had been executed as planned, every position held, and every shell and bullet had landed where intended. Yet the faces of the fallen and the cries of the wounded underscored the brutal reality behind the tactical success. Commanders walked the positions, tallying the impact of the ambush, while medics and support teams worked frantically to treat survivors. Even in victory, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on every soldier, and the haunting sight of the battlefield lingered long in their minds. The ambush had not only decimated Japanese forces, it had shattered their morale and broken the cohesion of their defensive lines. Units that had once held the island with discipline and resolve were now fragmented, disoriented, and demoralized. The illusion of the American retreat had exploited the Japanese confidence, and the resulting slaughter left their command structure in chaos. Officers struggled to regroup survivors, but the sudden loss of so many experienced soldiers and leaders made coordinated resistance nearly impossible. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. Those who survived spoke later of confusion, fear, and disbelief, realizing that what they had thought was victory had turned into one of the most crushing defeats of their campaign. The civilians on Saipan, already caught in the middle of the battle, now faced the aftermath of the ambush. Families emerged cautiously from hiding, confronted by a landscape scarred with death and destruction. Homes, villages, and farms were damaged or destroyed, and essential resources had been disrupted. Many civilians witnessed the horrors of the battlefield firsthand, an experience that would leave lasting psychological scars. The presence of the ambush's aftermath reminded everyone, combatant and non-combatant alike, of the devastating consequences of strategic warfare and of how quickly life could be upended by a single moment of violence. Military historians later analyzed the ambush and its consequences in meticulous detail. The precision, timing, and psychological manipulation involved in the fake retreat became a case study in military strategy, demonstrating how deception could amplify the effectiveness of even a relatively small force.
The ambush showed that terrain, anticipation of enemy behavior, and coordination of combined arms, artillery, machine guns, and tanks could produce results far beyond raw numbers. Yet it also highlighted the inherent cost of war. Thousands of lives lost in mere minutes, families and communities forever altered, and the moral weight borne by those who had executed the plan. For the American forces, the ambush marked a turning point in the Saipan campaign. With Japanese defenses weakened and morale broken, the Marines were able to push deeper into the island, gaining control of key positions and securing vital footholds. The victory accelerated the American advance in the Pacific and demonstrated the effectiveness of combined planning and psychological strategy. But even as the battlefield was cleared and positions secured, the echoes of the ambush lingered. The ground bore the scars of violence, the jungle still whispered of the chaos that had erupted, and survivors carried memories that would never fade. The 18-minute ambush left an indelible mark on the Pacific War, remembered not just for its tactical brilliance, but for the profound human consequences. Soldiers on both sides, commanders and civilians alike, were forever changed by those minutes of destruction. The ambush became a cautionary tale in the study of warfare, illustrating both the extraordinary power of strategy and the devastating cost when lives collide with planning in the chaos of battle. It was a victory achieved through discipline and cunning, but a victory written in blood, smoke, and the silence of the fallen. Saipan itself became a symbol of the paradox of war, the intersection of tactical genius and human suffering. The lessons of the ambush were studied, remembered, and honored, yet the human cost remained undeniable. Every step taken by the Marines, every shell fired, and every maneuver executed had reshaped the lives of thousands. In the aftermath, the island was a testament to the destructive potential of war, a place where strategy met humanity in its most extreme form, and where the consequences of 18 minutes would echo for generations. Even decades later, the stories of that day continued to serve as a haunting reminder of how swiftly the fortunes of war could change, and how courage, fear, and human ingenuity collide in the most extraordinary ways. The 18-minute ambush on Saipan did more than just reshape a single battlefield. It left a lasting legacy that echoed through the Pacific War and beyond. Historians often describe it as a masterclass in military deception, a brief but decisive moment where strategy, timing, and human psychology converged to produce extraordinary results. The ambush proved that careful planning and understanding of the enemy could achieve what sheer numbers alone could not, and it became a benchmark for studying the art of warfare in the 20th century. The immediate effect on the Saipan campaign was dramatic. Japanese defenses had been shattered, their morale crushed, and their command structure disrupted. The American Marines, emboldened by the success of the operation, pressed forward to capture strategic positions across the island, gaining control over key ridges, caves, and supply routes. The ambush accelerated the collapse of Japanese resistance, shortening the campaign and demonstrating the decisive impact that a single, well-executed tactic could have on the larger course of a battle. Yet the significance of the ambush extended far beyond military victory. It became a symbol of the human dimensions of warfare, the interplay of courage, discipline, and fear. Soldiers who survived the ambush carried the memory of those 18 minutes for the rest of their lives, haunted by the sheer intensity of the engagement and the devastating consequences for the enemy. For Japanese survivors, it was a moment of both horror and revelation, a vivid demonstration of the consequences of overconfidence and the lethal power of strategy in modern combat. Civilians on the island, too, were marked forever, witnessing how swiftly lives could be destroyed and communities torn apart. In the decades that followed, military academies studied the ambush at Saipan as an example of effective deception and tactical planning. Officers analyzed every element: the preparation of the terrain, the timing of artillery and machine gun fire, the psychology of enticing the enemy into a trap, and the coordination required across multiple units to achieve synchronized destruction. The lessons learned influenced later operations in the Pacific and informed military thinking in conflicts around the world. Commanders saw in Saipan a reminder that war is not merely a contest of strength, but also a contest of mind and ingenuity. The legacy of the battle was also a moral and psychological one. While it showcased brilliance in planning and execution, it also highlighted the extreme cost of such operations. Over 2,800 Japanese soldiers were killed in mere minutes, a number that forced both historians and participants to confront the human toll of tactical success. The ambush became a case study not only in effectiveness, but in the ethics and responsibilities of command, showing how decisions made in the minds of leaders could have immediate and irreversible consequences for thousands of lives. It was a victory written in precision and calculation, but also a story of suffering and the fragility of human life in war. Beyond its military and ethical lessons, the ambush influenced the cultural memory of the Pacific War. Saipan came to represent both the intensity of the conflict and the extremes to which soldiers were pushed. Memoirs, documentaries, and historical studies continually referenced the 18-minute battle as a turning point, emphasizing how a fleeting moment could leave an enduring mark. The story of the ambush was retold not merely for its dramatic impact, but because it captured the paradox of war, that genius and horror can coexist, and that the decisions of a few can shape the destinies of thousands. The ambush also shaped the broader strategy of the American campaign in the Pacific. Commanders realized the power of deception, coordination, and psychological manipulation, applying these lessons in subsequent operations on islands such as Tinian and Guam. The effectiveness of combined arms, careful timing, and exploiting enemy expectations became central tenets of Pacific warfare. Yet even as these lessons were applied, the memory of those 18 minutes on Saipan served as a reminder that every tactical decision carried consequences that were immediate and profound. Ultimately, the legacy of the 18-minute ambush is one of paradox. It is remembered as a brilliant execution of strategy, a decisive moment in a brutal campaign, and a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. At the same time, it remains a haunting reminder of the human cost of war, the thousands of lives lost in moments, the survivors who bore witness to unimaginable destruction, and the civilians whose lives were forever altered. Saipan stands as a symbol of the extremes of conflict, a place where courage, fear, strategy, and humanity collided, and where a brief moment reshaped the course of history. The 18-minute battle remains etched into memory not merely as a tactical achievement, but as a profound lesson in the power, peril, and tragedy of war.